Hello and welcome. Deep within the infinite corridors of the Dungeons and Dragons Multiverse, beyond the golden spires of Sigil and the blood-soaked fields of Avernus, past every world you have ever rolled dice in, there are places that the living have nearly stopped speaking of. Worlds full of kingdoms and catastrophes. Worlds where the gods walk differently, where magic behaves by rules you have never encountered, where entire civilizations rose and fell before a single player character ever thought to ask why. These are not dead worlds. They were never killed. They were simply set aside, shelved, allowed to gather dust, while newer, shinier adventures beckoned from the front of the store. But they are still out there, and tonight you are going to find them. Before we descend into these settings, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the surest way to find your path back to our library of lore when you wake. Section 1. The Forgotten Multiverse. The Dungeons and Dragons Multiverse, at its core, is an idea about infinite possibility. Since the earliest days of the game, the designers and writers behind it understood something profound. One world could never be enough. A single continent, a single cosmology, a single style of play. None of these could contain the full breadth of what the game could be. So they built more. They built many more. Over the decades, from the late 1970s all the way through the present day, the game has produced more distinct campaign settings than most modern players even know exist. You probably know Faerun. You have likely spent time in the Forgotten Realms, walking the cobblestone streets of Waterdeep, or descending into the dangerous depths of the Underdark. You may know Greyhawk, the setting that Gary Gygax himself called home. You may know Dragonlance, with its fallen gods and its legendary heroes. You might even know the gothic horror of Ravenloft, or the psionic wastelands of Athas, the world of Dark Sun. These settings have stayed in print, stayed in conversation, stayed alive in the memory of the community. They have advocates. They have champions. They have new editions and reprints, and passionate communities who refused to let them go. But there are others. There are worlds that burned bright for a few years in the 1990s and then went quiet. There are settings that received a handful of source books, maybe a novel or two, and then simply stopped. The company moved on. The writers moved to new projects. The players who loved those worlds aged and scattered. And the worlds themselves slipped beneath the surface of popular memory, like stones dropped into still water. This is a journey into the forgotten horizons of the Dungeons and Dragons Multiverse. You are going to visit places that most modern players have never heard of, and some that even veteran players have only glimpsed in passing. You are going to learn about a world ruled by divine bloodlines and political intrigue, where the power in your veins determines your right to rule a kingdom. You are going to explore a world inspired by the Arabian Nights, where the winds of fate carry every soul toward a destiny written in the stars. You are going to wander a forgotten continent in the western shadow of Faerun's ocean, where civilizations built pyramids and fed their gods with sacrifice. You are going to walk the hollow interior of a world within a world, where the sun never truly sets, and the dead past lives on in living color. And you are going to sail between crystal spheres in a vessel shaped like a nautilus shell, crossing an ocean of luminous fire with nothing but a magical helm and a compass that points toward wonder. The multiverse of Dungeons and Dragons is built on a concept called the Great Wheel. The planes of existence are arranged like the spokes of a vast cosmic construction. At the center sits the material plane, where most mortal life unfolds. Around it orbit the inner planes, the elemental foundations of reality, the realms of fire and earth and air and water, and the energies of life and death. Further out stretch the outer planes, the realms of gods and fiends, of celestials and demons, the ideological forces that shape all existence. Connecting everything is the astral plane, a silver void through which thought and memory travel as easily as wind through an open door. And spinning within this vast arrangement, like jewels strung on an endless thread, are the individual worlds of the material plane. Each world is its own crystal sphere, its own bubble of reality, separated from the next by a roiling, luminous sea called the phlogiston. Each sphere contains its own sun, its own moons, its own planets, its own story. Spelljamming vessels, ships enchanted with magical helms that respond to the will of a trained pilot, once crossed this ocean of fire and light regularly. Merchants and adventurers sailed between spheres, trading goods and knowledge and danger across the infinite dark. Within each sphere, a world lived and breathed and died according to its own rules. Some of these worlds knew about the others. Some were entirely unaware that they were just one jewel among thousands. And some of them, the ones you are about to explore, have been visited so rarely in recent memory that they exist in a kind of twilight, neither fully remembered nor fully gone. The reasons why certain settings faded are not mysterious. Dungeons and Dragons in the 1990s was a company in turbulent waters. TSR, the publisher that owned the game at the time, had expanded aggressively throughout that decade. They produced an enormous number of campaign settings in a very short period. Birthright arrived in 1995. Al-Qadim had launched in 1992. Mastica had come out in 1991. Spelljammer had launched in 1989. Dark Sun arrived in 1991. Mystara had been the backbone of the basic dungeons, and dragons line for well over a decade. All of these worlds existed simultaneously. All of them were competing for shelf space, for reader attention, for the dollars of players who could only afford so many source books in a single year. The market fragmented. Sales spread thinner and thinner across more and more products. TSR ran into serious financial trouble and was eventually purchased by Wizards of the Coast in 1997. Wizards, preparing to launch the third edition of the game in the year 2000, made the decision to consolidate. They would focus on a smaller number of settings. The Forgotten Realms would anchor the line. Greyhawk would serve as the default setting for the new edition's core rulebooks. Eberron would arrive later in 2004 as a fresh creation designed specifically for the new era. Dragonlance would persist, carried largely by its novels. Ravenloft would linger in various forms. The others were quietly retired. There was no grand farewell, no final source book that closed the story with a definitive ending. They simply stopped receiving new material. The worlds went on existing within the pages of the books that had already been published, within the memories of the players who loved them. But the official machinery of the game moved on without them. Some received brief mentions in later supplements, a paragraph here or a sidebar there, a quiet acknowledgement that yes, these places exist somewhere in the multiverse, but the spotlight had moved. And that is where you come in. Because tonight, you are going to be the one who remembers. You are going to walk through these forgotten places with fresh eyes, and you are going to understand why the people who loved them so fiercely, and why the loss of active support for these worlds still echoes in the quieter corners of this hobby. The first world you are going to visit is Cerelia, the continent at the heart of the birthright setting. Cerelia is a world where a catastrophic divine war, fought thousands of years before the present day of the setting, shattered the gods themselves and scattered their divine essence into the bloodlines of the mortal survivors who stood on the battlefield when the gods died. In Cerelia, the blood running through your veins is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic way of describing ancestry or heritage. It is literal divine power. It is inheritance made into something you can feel and wield. It is a claim on the land itself. The birthright setting is unlike anything else Dungeons and Dragons ever produced. And its mechanics, its flavor, and its deeply political lore represent one of the most ambitious world-building experiments in the entire history of the game. From Cerelia, you are going to cross the sea to Zakhara, the land of fate, the setting at the heart of Al-Qadim. Zakhara is a world built on the rich traditions of the Arabian Nights, of flying carpets and bound jinn, of corsairs cutting through warm blue waters under a sun like a copper coin in the sky, of philosophers and sorcerers and holy slayers, all debating the nature of fate beneath a vast and merciless desert. Zakhara shares a planet with Faerun, but it feels like a different universe. Its people call themselves the Enlightened, and they have a very specific idea about what that word means. Then you are going to travel further still, to Mastika, the continent on the far western shore of Faerun's ocean. Mastika is a land of feathered serpents and obsidian blades, of priests who feed their gods the beating hearts of those offered in sacrifice, of an empire that has never heard of plate armor or iron swords, and of a people facing a moment of contact with Faerun that will reshape everything they know about their world and their gods. After Mastika, you are going to descend into Mystara, the world that shaped an entire generation of players who began their adventures with the red-boxed basic dungeons and dragons' rules in the 1980s. And you are going to discover that inside this world, there is another world entirely. A hollow earth lit by an inner sun, filled with lost civilizations frozen in time, and preserved peoples who have no idea that the surface world above them has moved on without them. Finally, you are going to pull back. You are going to climb into the astral reaches and look at the original Spelljammer setting in all its strange, wonderful, irreplaceable glory. And you are going to understand exactly what was unique about that setting, exactly what made it unlike anything before or after, and exactly what the modern revival of Spelljammer in the 5th edition of the game chose to leave behind. Each of these worlds is waiting for you. Each one has a story that has not been properly told in a very long time. So settle in, let your breathing slow. Let the noise of everything else fade back behind the edges of the moment. The multiverse is wide, the forgotten horizons are deep, and this is only just the beginning. Section 2, Cerelia, Blood and Thrones. The world you are about to enter smells like rain on cold stone. It smells like iron and old parchment, like the throne rooms of kingdoms that have been standing for 1,000 years, and the dark corridors beneath them where something older still waits. Cerelia is a continent that carries its history in the bodies of its people, not in their libraries, not in their monuments, not in the songs their bards sing around crackling fires, though it lives in all of those places too. It carries its history in the blood, in the literal, cellular, physical substance of the blood, moving through the veins of every blooded soul born on this land. And that is where your story begins. You are a regent. That is the word this world uses for someone like you. A regent is a ruler, yes, but the word means something deeper here, something older. To be a regent in Cerelia is to carry a fragment of something divine inside you. Not borrowed divinity, not the granted power that a cleric receives when they pray to their god and feel the warmth of answered devotion. Something more intimate and more dangerous than that. Something that was not given to you. Something that was simply there in the blood you inherited from an ancestor who stood on a battlefield so catastrophic, so cosmically violent, that the gods themselves were torn apart by it. The Battle of Mount Deismar. Say that name slowly and let it settle into you. Mount Deismar is the fulcrum of everything in Cerelia. Every bloodline, every Ansheglian, every scrap of Regency power, every political dynasty and arcane tradition and racial memory on this continent traces itself back to a single moment on that mountain. A battle fought thousands of years before the present day of the setting. A battle between the gods of Cerelia and a dark power known as Azrai. Azrai was not simply an evil god in the conventional sense. The gods of Cerelia had a very specific cosmological arrangement. 5 great human tribes settled the continent in ancient times, and each tribe carried the devotion of a divine patron. The Anuirans, the most martial and empire-minded of the human peoples, followed Anduiras, a god of war and nobility. The Brekts, traders and seafarers by nature, followed Brenna, a goddess of commerce and cunning. The Kenasi, scholars and mages drawn from a culture that prizes learning above almost everything else, followed Basia, a goddess of the sun and knowledge. The Arjuric, a northern people living close to the land in ways that would remind you of Norse traditions, followed Rainier, a god of nature and the wilderness. And the Voss, a grim and brutal people of the East, originally followed Vorin, a god of magic and the moon. But the Voss did not stand on the side of the gods when the final battle came. Azrai had worked at them for a long time, pulling at the cracks in their society, whispering into the ears of their leaders. And by the time the armies gathered at Deismar, the Voss had been turned. They fought on Azrai's side. They carried the dark god's banner up that mountain. And when the divine explosion tore through everything at the battle's end, the essence that soaked into Voss survivors was not the bright divine fire of Anduiras or Rainier. It was something colder and more jagged. The gods that emerged from Azrai's shattered essence and eventually became the Voss patrons, the brutal Belinik and the ice-hearted Krisha, reflect everything about what that people absorbed on Deismar. Based on what we know of Azrai's corrupting influence and the nature of the bloodlines that passed into the Voss, the hardness at the center of their culture is not simply tradition. It may well be divine inheritance. The non-human peoples of Cerelia also had their divine connections, and some of them arrived at Deismar in ways that complicate the simple narrative of gods versus darkness. The elves, who call themselves the Sidhelion, were not standing on the side of light when the battle began. Azrai had been working at them as well, nursing their old and genuine grievances against the human tribes who had been spreading across Cerelia. And cutting into the ancient forests, the Sidhelion regarded as sacred. Many elven warriors rode to Daesmar fighting for Azrai, convinced that the dark god's victory would push humanity back and restore the world to what it had been. It was only in the midst of the battle itself, as the scale of Azrai's true intentions became impossible to ignore, that most of the elven forces turned and changed sides. They switched because they realized they had been used, not liberated. The Sidhelion pride and the weight of that near betrayal are threads you can still feel running through elven culture in the present day of the setting. A guilt and a defiance wound together into something that makes them very difficult to simply trust or dismiss. The Mazicians are the fifth human tribe, and their story is the one that ended most completely at Daesmar. They followed Maesla, goddess of the sea, and they fought bravely. But the destruction at the mountain's peak fell on them with particular ferocity. The Mazicians, as a distinct people, were effectively destroyed in the battle and its aftermath. Their bloodlines and their cultural memory were absorbed over time into what became the Kenasi. And while Bassian culture carries traces of Mazecian tradition, in the way that all absorbed peoples leave fingerprints on those who absorbed them, the Mazicians, as a people, are gone. Maesla's divine essence scattered into the survivors. But there were not enough of them to build a distinct civilization around it. Azrai was not simply an evil god in the way that, say, a god of murder or plague might be evil. Azrai was the god of darkness and shadow, a force of pure corruption who had spent untold ages working at the foundations of Cerealian society, whispering in ears and rewriting loyalties, and gathering followers among every race that could be turned. By the time the other gods and their mortal followers understood the full scope of what Azrai had been doing, the dark god had built an army unlike anything Cerelia had ever faced. The Battle of Mount Daesmar was the confrontation that could not be avoided. What happened on that mountain was not merely a military engagement. It was a cosmic event. The gods of Cerelia, understanding that Azrai's power had grown to a point where conventional opposition could not stop it, made a choice that cost them everything. They poured their divine essence directly into the mortal armies fighting on the mountain. They gave themselves up. They flooded the battlefield with their power in an act of divine sacrifice that destroyed Azrai, but destroyed themselves in the process. The explosion of divine energy released in that moment was so vast, so overwhelming, so far beyond anything the mortal world had ever been asked to contain, that it did not simply dissipate. It landed. It fell upon the survivors of that battle like rain, like fire, like something between a blessing and a wound. And it sank into their bodies and became part of them. The mortals who stood on Mount Daesmar and survived walked away, carrying fragments of dead gods inside them. The divine essence of Anduiras flowed into some, the essence of Brenna into others. Rainier and Basia and Vorin and Maesla all scattered into the survivors. Even Azrai, even the dark god's shattered essence, found hosts. And that last part is where things become deeply complicated. Those who absorbed the essence of the fallen bright gods became the first true bloodline holders of Cerelia. Their children inherited diluted versions of that divine spark. Their grandchildren inherited it again, further diluted, further removed from the raw fire of that original moment. Over the generations, these bloodlines became the currency of Cerilian society. To be blooded is to be someone. To carry the essence of a dead god in your ancestry is to have a claim on something larger than yourself. Land responds to you differently. People sense the power in you and react to it, sometimes with awe, sometimes with fear, often with both. The magic of regency flows through you, allowing you to bind your soul to a domain of territory and feel it as an extension of your own body. But those who absorbed the essence of Azrai, those survivors, did not receive a blessing. What they received was a transformation, slow and terrible and ongoing, that pushed them away from their original forms and towards something monstrous. Azrai's corrupted divine essence did not simply enhance its hosts the way the bright bloodlines did. It remade them. Over years and decades, and sometimes centuries, the most heavily corrupted became what Cerelia calls the Onsheglian. Blood spawn, creatures of immense power and terrible appearance, who retain their original intelligence and cunning, even as their bodies twist into something that does not belong to the mortal world. The Gorgon is perhaps the most famous of these. An ancient being of iron and darkness, he rules a domain in the northern Anuiran marches called the Gorgon's Crown. And his stronghold, the fortress of Calsathrak, is a place that experienced regents do not plan military expeditions toward without a great deal of careful thought. The Gorgon is so old and so deeply transformed by Azrai's essence that he barely resembles whatever he once was. He rules absolutely and plans on timescales that dwarf the ambitions of the human kingdoms around him. He is not simply a monster you fight. He is a political force, a military power, an intelligence that has been playing the long game of Cerilian geopolitics since before the oldest human dynasty, now standing, was first founded. The Onsheglian are not all as powerful as the Gorgon, but they are all dangerous in the specific way that a corrupted divine bloodline makes something dangerous. They are not simple beasts. The spider rules a web of political manipulation from a domain that bears his name. The Hydra controls portions of the eastern coast. The vampire holds sway over a territory where the dead walk and the living pay their tithes in blood. Each one is a former person, or perhaps a former creature, who reached a tipping point where Azrai's essence finally overwhelmed the original self entirely. They are monsters with kingdoms, and the other regents of Cerelia must contend with them as they contend with any other rival power. This is what makes Cerelia so mechanically and narratively revolutionary. In most Dungeons and Dragons settings, being an adventurer and being a ruler are two separate things. You go on adventures. You accumulate wealth and experience. If the story calls for it, you might eventually be granted a keep or a title. But in Birthright, those two things are fused at the structural level of the game itself. You are both the adventurer who descends into dangerous places and the regent who must manage a domain between those adventures. And the domain management in Birthright is not a simplified side mechanic or a hand-wavy abstraction. It is a full system, as detailed and considered as any combat rule set the game has ever produced. As a regent, you hold provinces. Each province has a level representing its population, its productivity, its capacity to generate the resource at the heart of Regency play. Beyond raw income, you hold or contest holdings within those provinces. A law holding represents your legal authority and enforcement presence. A guild holding represents commercial interests and trade infrastructure. A temple holding represents religious influence and the loyalty of the faithful. A source holding represents access to the magical ley lines that run through the land itself, allowing mages to pull arcane power directly from the territory. Managing all of this requires something called Regency points. Regency points are the most distinctive resource in the entire Birthright system, and they flow from the connection between your bloodline and your domain. The stronger your bloodline, the more Regency points you generate from your holdings. The more Regency points you spend, the more domain actions you can take during each season of play. A domain action might be collecting taxes, or going to war with a neighboring regent, or attempting to create a trade route, or contesting an enemy's holding in a province you both claim influence over. The strategy of it is real. The decisions are meaningful. A regent with a weak bloodline, but clever political instincts, can outmaneuver a rival with powerful divine essence if they spend their Regency points wisely and build alliances that multiply their reach. And here is where blood theft enters the picture, quiet and terrible, like a blade drawn in a crowded room. If you kill a blooded character and perform the act correctly, with intent, and with your own bloodline already active within you, you can absorb their bloodline, their divine essence, everything they inherited from those ancient survivors of Mount Desmar passes into you. Your bloodline score increases, Your blood abilities may change or grow. The divine essence is not destroyed when a blooded character dies. It passes on. It finds a new vessel. This is why assassination is never purely a political act in Cerelia. Every murder of a regent is also a ritual, a claiming, a statement about who deserves to carry the essence of dead gods and who does not. Blood abilities are the specific manifestations of a bloodline in a given individual. Some are subtle, enhanced senses, a preternatural understanding of weather, an instinctive knowledge of their domain's geography and the emotional state of their population. Others are dramatic, the ability to move with unnatural speed, to call fire from their hands without spellcasting, to inspire absolute loyalty in those around them simply by being present and willing it. The most powerful blood abilities are extremely rare and tied to high bloodline scores. A regent with a bloodline score so elevated that it approaches the threshold between mortal and something more is referred to as a true blood. And their abilities converge on the supernatural in ways that blur the line between regent and divine agent. The 5 human cultures of Cerelia deserve their own moment of attention because each one is fully realized in a way that makes the continent feel genuinely inhabited rather than simply populated. The Anuiran Empire once dominated Cerelia, the way ancient Rome dominated the Mediterranean world. At its height, the empire was enormous, its roads cutting across the continent, its legions enforcing a single law across 100 provinces. But empires fall. The Anuiran Empire fractured under pressures too numerous and too deep to summarize briefly. And the present day of the birthright setting finds its former territories divided among dozens of successor states, each ruled by a regent who traces their legitimacy back to that imperial tradition in one way or another. The politics are endlessly complex. Old loyalties and old grievances sit side by side. The dream of restoring the empire is alive in some hearts, and a profound threat to independence in others. The Brecks are a merchant culture in the finest tradition, practical and pragmatic, building their power through trade networks and guild structures rather than military conquest. Their coastal cities are wealthy and competitive and deeply suspicious of anyone who seems to be accumulating too much power over the flow of commerce. The Kenasi are perhaps the most magically sophisticated of the human cultures, a people for whom arcane learning is a mark of status and a public good, carrying within their traditions traces of the lost Mazetian people they absorbed over centuries. Their cities are built around libraries and academies, and their mages are among the most powerful on the continent. The Arjuric live in a colder world, literally and figuratively, a northern land of forests and fjords, where the relationship between a clan and its land is understood as sacred and deeply personal. Their druids and their rangers are legendary. The Voss are the most feared and least understood of the 5 human cultures. A people whose absorption of Azrai's essence has filtered down through generations into something that may not be consciously recognized as corruption, but feels, to outsiders, like a civilization shaped around the cold end of things. Their gods Belinik and Krisha, divine beings who emerged from the scattered pieces of Azrai's essence after Desmar, demand devotion in forms that the other cultures find deeply unsettling. And woven through all of this are the Sidhelion. The elves of Cyrilia do not view the humans sharing their continent with the cautious warmth or benign tolerance that elves in other settings sometimes offer. They remember when Cyrilia was entirely theirs. They remember the human tribes arriving, spreading, multiplying, clearing forests, building roads, draining swamps, and generally reshaping the land in ways that cut against everything the Sidhelion understand to be right and necessary. And behind all of that memory sits the quieter, harder truth of Desmar. The elves know what they almost did. Some of them know it very clearly. The complicated relationship between the Sidhelion and the human regions is one of the richest ongoing narrative threads in the entire setting, layered with a guilt and a grief that the elves themselves rarely speak of directly, but that shapes everything they do. The shadow world, a mirror plane that exists just out of phase with the material world of Cyrilia, adds another layer of cosmic weight to everything. The shadow world is the realm of the dead, the place where mortal souls travel after death. But it is also a real geographic location that determined travelers can enter and navigate. It is a darker, colder, more decayed version of Cyrilia, where the living landscape of the material world is reflected as something drained and haunted. Creatures from the shadow world cross over into the material world with unpleasant regularity. And those with a strong connection to Azrai's essence sometimes find that the shadow world responds to them differently than it does to others, as if it recognizes something kindred in them. This could imply that the dark god's presence was never fully destroyed at Desmar, that some residual will or pattern persists in the plane of death itself, drawing the Ansheglion and the most corrupted blooded souls toward it like a long, slow tide. The weight of all of this, the divine bloodlines and the domain management and the monster regents and the ancient elven near betrayal and the shadow plane pressing against the membrane of the material world, gives the birthright setting a texture that most other Dungeons and Dragons worlds simply do not have. It is a world where you cannot separate personal power from political reality, where the state of your kingdom reflects the state of your soul, where the gods may be dead, but their essence is still shaping every dynasty and every dynasty's end. It is a world worth remembering. Section 3. Zachora and Mastika. The wind changes when you cross certain kinds of water, not just in temperature or in the salt weight of the air, but in something less nameable, something that moves through you rather than around you. A shift in the quality of possibility itself. The sea between Cerilia and the next world on your journey carries that kind of wind. It carries the smell of spice and warm stone, of ink and cardamom, and the faint copper trace of ginfire on a still evening. The world you are sailing toward has a name that its people speak like a prayer and a verdict at the same time. They call it Zachora, and the first thing Zachora wants you to understand about itself is that your fate was already written before you arrived. Al-Qadim launched in 1992 as one of the most distinctive and carefully researched campaign settings that TSR had ever produced. The design team, working closely with cultural consultants and drawing deeply from the traditions of Arabic literature and the geographical and philosophical breadth of the medieval Islamic world, created something that genuinely felt unlike any other corner of the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse. Zachora is not a caricature. It is not a shallow collection of flying carpets and treasure caves dressed up in borrowed aesthetics. It is a world with its own philosophy, its own political geography, its own internal logic, and its own deep and complicated spiritual life. The continent of Zachora occupies the southern portion of the same planet as Faerun, separated from the northern continent by vast stretches of desert and the waters of the crowded sea. It is a warm land, sun-soaked and wind-carved, defined in large measure by extremes. Extreme heat in the deep desert, extreme beauty in the coastal cities built on the edges of the Golden Gulf, extreme wealth concentrated in the hands of merchants and caliphs, and the corsairs who operate in the gray space between legitimate trade and outright plunder. Extreme poverty, pressing against the edges of all that wealth in the narrow streets behind the grand bazaars. Zachora is a world that does not pretend that life is fair. What it offers instead is something it considers more honest than fairness. It offers fate. The philosophical and spiritual center of Zachoran life is a concept called enlightenment. The enlightened, which is what Zachoran society calls its fully participating members, regardless of their ethnic background or homeland of origin, share a common understanding of the divine that is unusual by Dungeons and Dragons standards. In most settings, the gods are distinct and competitive, each one demanding exclusive or at least preferential devotion from their followers. Each one engaged in divine politics that filter down into mortal wars and crusades and inquisitions. Zachora takes a different position. The enlightened do not deny the existence of multiple deities. They simply regard them all as aspects or expressions of one underlying divine principle, the force they understand as fate. A Zakaran cleric devoted to Hajama, the goddess of courage, and a Zakaran cleric devoted to Selan, the goddess of the moon, are not enemies by definition. They serve different faces of the same ultimate truth. This theological flexibility makes Zakaran society more internally tolerant in matters of religion than most other cultures you will encounter in Faerun or anywhere else on the planet. The Lawgiver is the most important figure in Zakaran history, and she is important in the way that the founder of a legal and philosophical tradition is important, meaning that she shaped everything and everyone who came after her, even though she herself lived so long ago that the details of her actual life have blurred into legend. The law of the Lawgiver is the legal and moral framework that holds Zakaran civilization together. It is a complex and extensive body of guidance, covering everything from the rights of individuals to the proper conduct of trade to the obligations of rulers to their subjects. The law is interpreted and administered by scholars called Qadi, and the process of interpreting the law in new situations is itself a respected intellectual tradition. Being an educated, thoughtful, contributing participant in Zakaran civilization means engaging with the law, debating it, understanding its principles well enough to apply them intelligently. At the political apex of Zakaran civilization sits the Grand Caliph, who rules from the city of Huzaz, the city of delights, the largest and most magnificent urban center in all of Zakara. Huzaz sits at the heart of the Golden Gulf, a spectacular natural harbor where the waters are so clear and so blue that sailors claim you can see the bottom even in the deep places. The city is a wonder of architecture and commerce and culture, a place where the greatest musicians and poets and scholars of the continent compete for patronage and recognition, where the Grand Caliph holds court in a palace of such extravagance that the descriptions of it in the source books read like something between history and dream. The Grand Caliph is theoretically the supreme political authority over all the enlightened lands of Zakara. But the reality is considerably messier, as it always is when political authority is stretched across a vast and diverse geography. The free cities of Zakara are places unto themselves, each one a distinct culture and power center, each one related to the Grand Caliph in Huzaz through a combination of genuine loyalty, strategic deference, and calculated independence. The merchants of the free cities are among the most sophisticated traders in the known world, and their guild structures and trade alliances create webs of obligation and interest that cut across formal political lines. A Zakaran merchant prince is not simply a wealthy person. They are a political entity, a cultural patron, a military force with hired swords and corsair contracts, and a theological actor whose temple donations and religious affiliations carry real weight in the ongoing conversation about what enlightenment actually means in practice. The genies of Zakhara are not simply monsters to fight or magical conveniences to exploit. They are persons in the fullest sense that the setting can offer, with their own cultures and their own politics and their own very strong opinions about the mortals who inhabit the same world they do. The four major types of genies: the jinn of elemental air, the efreet of elemental fire, the Tao of elemental earth, and the marids of elemental water. Each maintain their own noble courts and their own complex social hierarchies. The jinn are perhaps the most well-disposed toward mortals, airy and whimsical, and prone to finding the short-lived creatures of the material world entertaining, in the way that a long-lived being might find a particularly clever animal entertaining. The efreet are considerably less warm, proud, and powerful, and deeply resentful of any relationship with mortals that positions the efreet as subordinate. Given the depth of efreet pride described throughout Al-Qadim's sourcebooks, it seems reasonable to infer that the practice of binding efreet to service was not merely unpleasant for the bound party, but a genuine cultural wound that the efreet courts have never fully set aside. The Sha'r is the character class that most perfectly captures Zakhara's relationship with genie kind. Unlike a conventional wizard who draws magical power from study and memorization, a Sha'r works through a familiar called a Djen, a tiny elemental being who serves as an intermediary between the Sha'r and the genie courts. When a Sha'r needs a spell, they send their Djen to find it in the genie courts, and the Djen returns with the spell after an amount of time that varies with the power and type of the spell sought. The Sha'r's magic is therefore never entirely within their own control. It is dependent on relationships, on the goodwill of genie courts, on the Djen's ability to navigate elemental politics on their master's behalf. This gives the Sha'r a very different relationship to magical power than any other arcane practitioner in the game. One rooted in negotiation and connection rather than purely personal mastery. Corsairs rule the crowded sea in the way that legends always seem to involve people who chose the horizon over the shore. The Zakharan Corsair tradition is rich and well-developed. A culture of sea raiders and sea traders who often blur the line between the two depending on the opportunity at hand. Their ships are fast and clever, their knowledge of the sea's moods and currents encyclopedic, their politics as complicated as any land-based faction. Some corsairs sail under the loose authorization of free city patrons, operating in a gray legal space that allows for plausible deniability when their activities cross the line from trade into something more aggressive. Others operate entirely independently, answerable to no one but the sea and their own code, which may be more or less principled depending on the captain. The haunted lands of the deep desert are Zakhara's oldest and most mysterious geography. These are places where the ancient world has not entirely released its grip on the present, where ruins of civilizations that predate the law of the Lorgover still stand half-buried in sand, where the spirits of the restless dead move through the air in patterns that experienced travelers learn to read and avoid. The haunted lands are also the home of the most powerful and least hospitable desert tribes. People who have learned to live in conditions that would kill most city dwellers within days, whose relationship to the deep desert is one of hard-won intimacy and genuine reverence. Zakhara is a world that rewards patience and curiosity. The more you sit with it, the more you walk its streets and sail its seas and argue with its philosophers about the nature of fate, the more you understand why the people who loved it the way they did. It gave them a corner of the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse where the cultural assumptions were different, where the defaults were challenged, where the game could breathe in a direction that felt genuinely unlike the pseudo-European fantasy that dominated so much of its history. And then you turn west. You cross the trackless sea, that vast and mostly uncharted expanse of deep ocean that stretches between the western coast of Faerun and something that most Faerun maps simply labeled as empty space. But the space was never empty. It was merely unknown. And on the far side of all that water, in a land that its own people call the true world, civilizations have been living and building and arguing with their gods, and feeding them blood for thousands of years before anyone on the eastern shore thought to go looking. Mastika arrived in 1991, built as an explicit analog of the Mesoamerican civilizations of the real world, drawing primarily from Aztec and Maya history, architecture, religious practice, and cultural structure. The setting was tied directly to the Forgotten Realms through an event called the Amnian Expedition, in which a mercenary force called the Golden Legion, financed by the merchant city of Am, sailed west and made contact with the people of Mastika in a moment that anyone familiar with the history of European contact with the Americas will recognize with an uncomfortable twist in their stomach. The true world is not a single nation. It is a continent with multiple distinct cultures and political entities. Just as Faerun contains dozens of different kingdoms and cultures. The most powerful civilization in Mastika at the time of contact is the Nexalan Empire, centered on the great city of Nexel, a metropolis of extraordinary scale and complexity built on an island in the middle of a wide lake, connected to the surrounding land by long causeways. Nexel is a city of tens of thousands of people, of pyramids and temples, and floating gardens and market squares, where goods from every corner of the true world change hands. It is a city of genuine beauty and genuine terror, because the beauty and the terror are inseparable in Mastica in a way that the setting takes very seriously. The gods of Mastica are not distant or abstract. They are present and demanding, and deeply embedded in the daily and ceremonial life of the people who serve them. Codal, the plumed serpent, is the closest thing Mastica has to a benevolent divine force. He is a god of peace and learning, of agriculture and the arts of civilization, of the green growing world. His worship involves flowers and music and the careful cultivation of knowledge. But Codal withdrew from the true world long before the events of the setting, departing in a moment of profound disappointment with his people. And his absence has left a spiritual vacuum that other forces have been filling in his place. Given how central his departure is to the present state of Mastica's spiritual life, it seems fair to say that the story of Codal is not really the story of a god who left. It is the story of a world still waiting for him to come back. Zoltek is the god who fills that vacuum most aggressively. The god of war and darkness, Zoltek is a deity who requires what he requires with a directness that allows for no comfortable evasion. He requires hearts, the beating hearts of sacrificial offerings, cut from living bodies by obsidian blades wielded by priests trained for exactly this purpose. Human sacrifice in Mastica is not a practice at the margins of religious life. It is central. It is the mechanism by which Zoltek's power is maintained, and by which the continued functioning of the world is understood to be guaranteed. The priests of Zoltek hold that without sacrifice, the sun will not rise, the crops will not grow, the world will slide into darkness. And while you, arriving from a different tradition, may regard this as a religious argument designed to justify atrocity, the Nexalan people believe it with the full weight of their lived experience and their cultural memory. This is what makes Mastica so narratively challenging and so valuable. It refuses to let you be comfortable. Alongside Zoltek and Codal, other Mastican gods shape the landscape of devotion. Azul is the god of water, and his worship involves the management of rainfall and flood, and the essential relationship between a farming civilization and the rains that make it possible. Tezca is the god of fire and the sun, fierce and bright, and associated with warriors who have proven themselves in combat. The Mastican pantheon is large and internally consistent, each deity tied to specific aspects of the natural world and specific social functions, each one receiving worship in forms that range from the communal and agricultural to the martial and sacrificial. Some of the more obscure divine figures in the pantheon appear only briefly in the canonical source books, and we might reasonably assume that a civilization of this size and complexity would have a much larger body of local and regional devotion, that the published material only partially captured. The magic of Mastica is divided into two distinct traditions that reflect the deep split in the continent's spiritual life. Pluma magic is the magic of Kotal and the light, practiced by weaving and working with feathers in intricate ritual patterns that channel divine energy. It is a magic of grace and patience, requiring deep craft knowledge and a meditative relationship with the materials and the divine force moving through them. Hishna magic is darker, rawer, more immediately powerful, and deeply unsettling to those who encounter it without preparation. Hishna draws its power from animal sacrifice and the use of animal body parts, teeth and claws and bones, in ritual constructions that focus and amplify a more primal magical force. Neither tradition maps neatly onto the arcane and divine magic system of conventional dungeons and dragons. And that difference is the point. Mastica wanted you to understand that you had arrived somewhere genuinely other. The Golden Legion's arrival changes everything and changes nothing simultaneously. The mercenaries, armed with iron weapons and wearing steel armor and accompanied by priests of Helm, arrive on the coast of Mastica with military advantages that the Mastican warriors, armed with obsidian-edged weapons and cotton armor, cannot easily overcome. The story of contact in Mastica does not shy away from what contact stories actually involve. The Golden Legion is there for gold. Their Amnian financiers want return on investment. Cordell, the captain who leads the expedition, is a complicated figure, capable of certain kinds of honor, and entirely capable of setting that honor aside when the cost of maintaining it becomes inconvenient. The priests of Helm who accompany the Legion bring their own religious agenda, and the collision between Helm's rigid, unyielding theological worldview and the complex living spirituality of the Mastican people creates conflicts that no amount of military advantage can simply resolve. The Eagle Knights and Jaguar Knights of Mastica are the continent's warrior elite, trained in traditions of individual combat that are genuinely dangerous and genuinely effective on their own terms. They fight to capture enemies for sacrifice as much as to kill them outright, which creates tactical patterns that the Golden Legion finds deeply disorienting in its first engagements. The warrior traditions of Mastica are not inferior to the martial traditions of Faerun. They are different, built for a different kind of warfare in a different cultural context. And that difference matters. What makes Mastica linger in the imagination is the tragedy built into its premise. You are watching a world at the moment before everything changes. A world that has its own completeness and its own deep internal logic, about to be disrupted by forces arriving from outside with no particular interest in understanding what they are disrupting. The true world will survive contact. Its people will adapt and resist and persist. But the world that existed before the Golden Legion sailed west will not survive unchanged. That loss, quiet and vast, and already inevitable by the time you arrive, gives Mastica the weight of something that matters. Section 4. Mystara, the Hollow World. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to old things. Not the silence of emptiness, not the absence of sound, but something more like the held breath of accumulated time. The world you are descending toward now carries that quiet in its bones, in its mountains and its coastlines, and the deep red soil of its farmlands. And it carries something else beneath all of that. Something that requires you to go further down than you have ever gone before to find it. Mystara is the world that raised a generation. And inside it, cradled in its hollow core like a secret kept for an eternity, is a world that Mystara raised within itself. To understand what Mystara means, you need to understand where it sits in the history of this game. Mystara was not the setting of advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It was the setting of basic Dungeons and Dragons, a separate and parallel version of the rules that ran alongside the advanced game from the late 1970s all the way through the early 1990s. If you picked up the red box, the one with Larry Elmore's painting of a dragon on the cover, the one that sat on toy store shelves and in the back of hobby shops and in the bedrooms of children who would grow up to be the designers and writers and dungeon masters of the next generation, you were holding the key to Mystara. Every module in that red box line, every black box and gold box and rules cyclopedia that followed, was set in this world, on a continent called the Known World, in a cluster of nations that were each built on a distinct cultural template and a distinct style of play. The Known World sits on the larger continent of Brunn. Though for most of the basic line's history, the Known World was itself the world as far as the published material was concerned. Later expansions and the Gazetteer series, which produced detailed source books for each of the Known World's major nations, eventually made the map much larger. But in the beginning, in those first red box adventures, the world was defined by a handful of territories, each one offering a different flavor of the experience you came to the game to have. Karamikos is the nation where most players begin. It is a young, rough-edged kingdom on the southeastern coast of the Known World, ruled by a Thaiatian noble named Duke Stefan Karamikos, who purchased the territory from the Thaiatian emperor in exchange for surrendering his family's ancient titles. The native people of the land, the Traladarans, have their own long history in that territory, their own legends, and their own complicated feelings about the Thaiatian colonizers who have arrived and planted a flag. and started calling their homeland by a new name. Karamikos has the frontier energy of a place where civilization is being built in real time over something that was already there. And that tension runs through its culture at every level. Glantry is where Mystara reveals something truly unusual about itself. Glantry is a nation of mages. Not a nation with mages in it. Not a nation where mages hold important positions, but a nation where magehood is the fundamental qualification for citizenship and political participation. The nobility of Glantry is entirely composed of arcane practitioners, and the practice of divine magic is banned outright. Clerics are illegal in Glantry. This is not merely a flavor detail or a quirky political note. It is a direct expression of Glantry's ruling class's worldview, which holds that divine magic represents a subordination of human potential to external powers that demand service in exchange for their gifts, and that arcane magic, drawn from the practitioner's own will and intellect, represents something purer and more honest. The fact that the immortals who function as gods in Mystara are themselves former mortals who achieved their status through personal striving rather than inherent divinity makes this argument considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than it might first appear. Thyates is the old empire, the Rome of the known world, sprawling and confident, and already in the long process of managing decline, without quite admitting to itself that the decline is real. The Thyatian military is legendary in its organization and its professionalism. Its legions capable of projecting force across distances that would exhaust most other armies. Thyatian culture is syncretic in the way that empires often are, absorbing traditions and peoples from every territory it has touched and building them into something new and distinctly its own. The relationship between Thyates and its rival empire, the magocratic kingdom of Alphasha, far to the east across the ocean, is the central geopolitical tension of the known world. A cold conflict between two entirely different civilizational philosophies that periodically turns hot in ways that remake the map. Alphasha is a continent unto itself, and its civilization is as old and as magnificent and as quietly strange as that suggests. Where Glantry is a nation of mages built on exclusivity and control, Alphasha is an empire of mages built on expansiveness and confident superiority. Alphashan culture assumes that arcane power is the most important thing in the world and structures every aspect of society accordingly. Non-magical citizens exist in a permanent state of second-class status, regardless of how skilled or talented or intelligent they might be in other domains. The Alphashan emperor, or empress, as is often the case given the matrilineal traditions woven through the culture, rules a sprawling empire that includes dozens of unique kingdoms and territories. each one permitted a remarkable degree of internal autonomy so long as it acknowledges Alphician supremacy and contributes to the imperial whole. But the immortals are what make Mystara philosophically distinct from every other campaign setting in the game's history. The immortals are not gods in the conventional sense. They do not sit in divine realms beyond the material plane, shaped by the cosmic architecture of the Great Wheel, feeding on worship, and engaged in ongoing divine politics with other deities. The immortals are former mortals, every single one of them, beings who reached the theoretical ceiling of mortal achievement in some domain. Whether that domain was magical power, or physical mastery, or accumulated wisdom, or some other form of excellence, and then crossed a threshold into a form of existence that transcends mortality without abandoning its origins entirely. The 5 spheres of power are the organizing principle of immortal existence and ambition. The sphere of thought encompasses knowledge, memory, philosophy, and the arts of the mind. The sphere of matter governs the physical world, the body, the land, the enduring solidity of things that persist. The sphere of energy is the realm of change and motion, fire and lightning, and the forces that drive transformation. The sphere of time is perhaps the most mysterious, associated with history and fate, and the deep patterns that connect events across centuries. The sphere of entropy is not evil in the simple sense, though mortal cultures tend to regard it that way. Entropy is the principle of endings, of dissolution and decay, of the cycling down of ordered things back into undifferentiated potential. It is necessary. It is the force that makes new beginnings possible by clearing away what has reached its completion. Each immortal belongs to one of these 5 spheres and draws their particular character and their particular portfolio of concerns from their sphere's nature. An immortal of thought might sponsor scholarly traditions and libraries and philosophers. An immortal of energy might be associated with warriors and with the fierce joy of transformation, and with fire in both its destructive and illuminating aspects. An immortal of entropy might oversee the ends of things, the honest acknowledgement that everything passes, the traditions of burial and remembrance, and the wisdom that comes from accepting that nothing lasts forever. What this means practically for mortal characters in Mystara is that the path to divinity is theoretically open to anyone willing to walk it far enough. The 4 paths of immortality, the path of the polymath, the path of the epic hero, the path of the paragon, and the path of the dynast, each represent a different way of achieving the specific qualities and accumulating the specific history that the immortals require of a candidate. They are not easy paths. They require achievements that most mortals cannot even imagine, let alone accomplish. But they are paths. They have steps. they can in principle be walked. This gives Mystara a quality of cosmic accessibility that most other settings lack entirely. Now you go deeper. Now you stop walking the surface of Mystara, and you begin to descend through the polar regions, through the frozen passes and the tunnels that bore down through the crust of the world itself. Because Mystara is not simply a sphere of rock and water and air. Mystara is a hollow world, and inside it, lit by an inner sun that burns at the center of the planet like a captive star, is a land where lost civilizations live on. The Hollow World campaign setting arrived in 1990 as a boxed set that expanded the Mystara cosmology in a direction that no one had quite predicted. The concept is this: the immortals, observing the surface world and its history, recognized that civilizations rise and fall, that whole peoples and their ways of living can be erased from existence by conquest or catastrophe or the simple passage of time, and that this erasure represents a genuine loss in the cosmic ledger of things that matter. So they did something about it. The driving force behind the hollow world, the immortal whose vision and effort made it a reality, is Ka the Preserver. Ka began his existence not as a humanoid being, but as a vast and ancient carnosaur, one of the great reptilian creatures of Mystara's prehistoric past, who over an unimaginable span of time achieved a level of intelligence and magical mastery that pushed him beyond the mortal threshold entirely. Ka cares about preservation in a way that goes beyond policy or preference. It is, for him, something closer to devotion. The spell of preservation that underlies the entire hollow world is his great working, carried out with the cooperation of other immortals who shared his concern, woven into the fabric of the inner surface in an act of magical engineering so vast that no mortal mind can fully comprehend its scope. It keeps cultures alive. It keeps them specifically themselves. A people transplanted into the hollow world by the immortals at the moment of their surface destruction does not evolve away from its essential character. The things that make them distinctly themselves, their languages, their religious practices, their social structures, their technologies, remain fundamentally stable within the hollow world. The civilization that would have been erased on the surface world continues living its own life inside the planet. The Nithian Empire is perhaps the most striking example of this preservation in practice. And it is also the example that makes the hollow world feel most like something with genuine moral weight beneath it. On the surface of Mystara, the Nithians are not merely forgotten. They are gone in a way that goes beyond the ordinary fading of history. The immortals laid upon the surface world a separate and distinct working known as the spell of oblivion, a magical erasure that removed not just the Nithians themselves, but all memory and record of them from the surface world's awareness. Historians cannot find them. Archaeologists uncover their ruins and cannot connect them to any known tradition. They are a mystery on the surface world and a living civilization inside it. The reason for this erasure matters. Thanatos, the great immortal of entropy, had worked through Nithian culture over generations, using their religious traditions and their imperial ambitions as a vehicle for spreading his influence in ways that threatened to corrupt the entire surface world from within. The immortals who opposed Thanatos could not simply defeat him militarily in the way that mortal armies defeat each other. What they could do was remove the civilization he had shaped into his instrument, transplanting the Nithian people into the hollow world, where the specific shape of Thanatos' corruption could not follow them in the same way, and then sealing the wound on the surface by erasing the memory of them entirely. The Nithians inside the hollow world did not experience this as punishment. They simply continued. They continued building and studying, and practicing their elaborate funerary traditions under the light of the inner sun. In a civilization that draws strongly from Egyptian history and aesthetics, with no knowledge that their surface counterparts had been deliberately removed from the world's memory. It is worth sitting with the complexity of that for a moment. The Nithians were not evil people. They were a people whose civilization had been gradually shaped by an immortal of entropy toward ends they may not have fully understood. Their removal was an act of cosmic intervention on a scale that makes the phrase uncomfortable to use lightly. Based on the structure of the Hollow World sourcebooks and the way cause philosophy of preservation is presented throughout the material, it seems reasonable to infer that the decision was not made easily, and that the ongoing preservation of the Nithians inside the planet is itself a form of acknowledgement that they deserved to continue existing, even if the surface world could not safely hold them. The Ascan Empire of the Hollow World presents one of the inner surface's most vivid and most complicated cultures. The Ascans are a warrior people of extraordinary martial fervor, devoted to their gods with an intensity that shapes every aspect of their daily and ceremonial life. Their primary deity is a figure named Atruatsin, associated with the sun and with the sacrificial traditions at the center of Ascan religious practice. But woven alongside legitimate Ascan devotion is a corruption that the Ascans themselves may not fully perceive. An immortal of the sphere of entropy named Atsantiatl has worked his way into the Ascan religious landscape over centuries, presenting himself as a legitimate object of devotion, while actually pulling Ascan culture in directions that serve his own entropic agenda. The relationship between what the Ascans sincerely believe and what Atsantiatl is actually doing with that belief is one of the Hollow World's most quietly unsettling, ongoing storylines. Based on how the material presents Atsantiatl's influence, we can reasonably assume that the Azcan's most extreme religious practices, the ones that push furthest into destruction and death, bear his fingerprints more than they bear those of any genuinely Azcan tradition. The Millennian Empire offers something different again, a Greco-Roman analog frozen at a particular moment of cultural and political development. Its senators debating in language that echoes ancient democratic traditions, its legions marching in formations that have not changed in centuries, because the spell of preservation ensures they do not need to change. The Millennians are not declining. They are not rising. They simply are in a state of cultural suspension, doing exactly what they were doing when the immortals placed them inside the world. The inner sun that lights all of this never sets. There is no night in the hollow world. The landscape curves upward rather than away at the horizon, so that if you look far enough in any direction on the inner surface, you see other portions of the inner world curving up and over your head, rather than dropping away below the curve of the planet as they would on the surface. It is deeply disorienting to anyone arriving from the surface world, that gradual recognition that the sky above you is not empty space, but is in fact more ground, more civilization, more of this impossible preserved world spread across the interior of a sphere that you are standing inside rather than on top of. The implications of the hollow world for Mystara's overall cosmology are staggering. The surface world forgets. History moves and changes and overwrites itself. The civilizations on the inner surface remember, whether they know it or not, simply by continuing to exist. The hollow world is Mystara's long memory, kept alive by divine intervention and maintained against the natural tendency of all things to pass. It is the answer Ka gave to entropy, and the sphere of entropy in the person of Thanatos and of Atsantiatl and of the quieter destructive forces that filter through every civilization on the inner surface, has never entirely stopped trying to find its way inside. Section 5. Spelljammer: The Lost Era. Pull back now. Let everything you have seen, the blood-soaked politics of Cerelia, the fate-woven streets of Zakhara, the obsidian altars of Mastica, the hollow warmth of Mystara's inner sun. Let all of it recede behind you like shoreline dropping below the horizon. You are rising. You are moving up through the atmosphere of whatever world you are standing on, up through the clouds and the cold, thin air above them, up through the final membrane where breathable sky gives way to something else entirely. You are leaving the material, plane's comfortable surfaces behind and entering the space between worlds. And out here, in the vast dark beyond atmosphere and gravity, something extraordinary has been waiting for you. The original Spelljammer setting launched in 1989, and it did something that no Dungeons and Dragons product had ever done before it, with quite such commitment and structural completeness. It took the multiverse literally. It built a vehicle for it. It looked at the fact that the game had produced dozens of distinct worlds across its history and said, what if those worlds were connected? What if a traveler with the right ship and the right knowledge could sail from one to another? What if the space between the crystal spheres that contain each world's solar system was not simply empty conceptual distance, but an actual, navigable, physically real environment with its own dangers and its own wonders and its own permanent population of people who had never lived on any planetary surface and had no particular desire to start. The cosmology that Spelljammer built to house all of this is one of the most inventive pieces of world building in the game's entire history. Each world exists within a crystal sphere, a vast hollow shell of an unknown material that surrounds an entire solar system, containing its sun or suns, its planets and moons, its asteroid fields and comets, everything within a single gravitational and magical relationship. The crystal sphere is enormously large, far larger than you might initially imagine, large enough that traveling from the inner edge of the sphere to the nearest planet within it can take weeks, even in a spell-jamming vessel. The sphere itself is opaque from the outside and transparent from the inside, and its surface is the boundary between the interior of the solar system and the phlogiston. The phlogiston, this word borrowed from an outdated real-world theory of combustion, describes the luminous, flowing, impossibly beautiful medium that fills all the space between crystal spheres. The phlogiston is not space in the conventional sense. It is not vacuum. It is a thick, flowing substance, wildly colorful and constantly in motion, full of brilliant currents that shift and change in ways that experienced navigators learn to read and inexperienced navigators learn to fear. The phlogiston is flammable, extremely, catastrophically flammable. Open flame in the phlogiston is a deadly risk, which creates interesting problems for a setting where fireball spells and fire-breathing monsters are entirely common. The phlogiston has no breathable air, but spell-jamming vessels maintain their own air envelope, a bubble of breathable atmosphere that clings to the hull of a ship for as long as there are living things on board to keep it fresh. The spell-jamming helm is the device at the heart of everything. It is a magical chair, essentially, though that description undersells what it actually is. A spell-jamming helm channels the magical energy of a spellcaster, connecting the caster's mind and magical reserves directly to the ship, allowing them to control the vessel's movement through willpower and magical force alone. A spellcaster sitting in a helm loses access to their spells for the duration, their magical energy is being consumed by the ship itself, converted into the thrust that moves the vessel through the phlogiston and through the atmospheric and gravitational fields within crystal spheres. More powerful spellcasters produce faster ships. A high-level wizard sitting in a major helm can push a vessel to velocities that make interplanetary travel a matter of weeks rather than years. The ships themselves are among the most memorable and visually distinctive elements of the original Spelljammer setting. The design philosophy was deliberate in its strangeness. These were not simply sailing ships with wings bolted on, not the elegant, streamlined vessels that the word spaceship might suggest to a modern imagination. They were bizarre. They were delightful. The hammer ship was a reliable workhorse, its hull shaped like the head of a hammer, blunt and practical, and capable of surviving a great deal of punishment. The flitter was a tiny one-person vessel, barely more than a chair and a helm and a few planks, used for scouting and courier work. The Nautiloid was the ship of the Illithids, the Mind Flayers, shaped exactly like the shell of a nautilus, beautiful and deeply threatening. Associated with a race whose motives toward other sentient beings are rarely benevolent. The Man-O-War was the elven military vessel, a ship of organic curves and living wood, grown rather than built, crewed by elven warriors who regarded the space between stars as their ancestral territory, and were not shy about enforcing that view. The major spacefaring races of the original Spelljammer setting are a gallery of the strange and the wonderful. The arcane, sometimes called the Mercane in later editions, are tall, blue-skinned beings of impeccable manners and absolute commercial focus. They are the manufacturers and primary sellers of spelljamming helms throughout the known crystal spheres. No one knows where they come from. No one knows what they ultimately want. They are polite. They are reliable. They will sell you exactly what you need at a price that is always precisely fair and never quite as advantageous to you as you hoped. And they have been operating this way across the multiverse for so long that questioning it feels slightly absurd. Based on how the original source books describe them, it seems fair to say the arcane almost certainly know things about the structure of the multiverse that no other living being has ever been told. And they have made a quiet, permanent decision never to share those things voluntarily. The Neogi are among the most disturbing creatures the Spelljammer setting ever produced, and the setting produced quite a few disturbing creatures. They are spider-like beings of slaveholder culture, deeply hierarchical in ways that involve the consumption of one's elders to absorb their power, thoroughly committed to the acquisition of slaves from every available species, and possessed of a psionic and magical capability that makes them dangerous far beyond what their physical size might suggest. The Neogi do not simply keep slaves. They regard slavery as the natural and correct state of affairs for any being insufficiently powerful to resist them. A philosophical position that the setting does not allow the player characters to simply ignore or treat as a background detail. If you are in wild space, you will encounter Neogi, and the encounter will require you to decide what you believe and what you are willing to do about it. The GIF are the setting's soldiers of fortune, large hippopotamus-headed beings of military bearing and professional pride, who love firearms with a passion that borders on the devotional. According to the original sourcebooks, the GIFs speak of a homeworld with the careful, controlled tone of people who have learned to live around a wound. And it seems reasonable to infer from that language that whatever happened to that world, whether lost, destroyed, or simply unreachable, it is not a subject they discuss openly with outsiders. The GIF as a people now exist almost entirely in wild space, moving between crystal spheres as mercenaries and soldiers and military advisors, maintaining a rigid hierarchical culture based on military rank, even when the specific unit structures that those ranks originally referred to no longer exist in any practical sense. A GIF officer insisting on proper forms of address while their ship is on fire is a very spelljammer kind of image. The Scrow deserve particular attention because they represent one of the original setting's most interesting pieces of creative work. The Scrow are orcs. Specifically, they are the descendants of orcs who were defeated in a great war against the elven imperial fleet, known as the First Unhuman War, driven from their homeworlds and scattered into wild space, and who then spent generations rebuilding themselves into something that the elves who fought them would find entirely unrecognizable. The Scrow are disciplined. They are militarily sophisticated. They maintain a strict code of conduct, honor their dead, educate their young in both warfare and statecraft, and regard the undisciplined brutality of their surface world orcish relatives with something approaching contempt. They are preparing for a second war against the elves, and unlike the first war, they intend to win it. Given how the original Spelljammer sourcebooks frame the tension between the elven imperial fleet and the Scrow, we can reasonably assume that what is quietly building in the corners of wild space is not simply a rematch. It is a civilizational reckoning that both sides have been moving toward with deliberate patience. The Rock of Bral is the location that most fully captures the texture of daily life in the Spelljammer setting. It is an asteroid, a large one tumbling through the wild space of a crystal sphere, covered on its flat underside with a city built by layers of ambition and desperate pragmatism, and the specific creative energy that comes when people from dozens of different worlds and species all end up in the same place and have to figure out how to coexist well enough to keep making money. Bral has a prince, a humanoid ruler of considerable political skill, whose legitimacy rests on a combination of military force, commercial alliance, and the sheer practical fact that someone has to be in charge. And he has been in charge long enough that challenging it costs more than accepting it. It has noble families whose fortunes are built on spelljamming trade routes. It has a thieves' quarter and a market district and a dock district where ships come in from across the multiverse and offload cargo and crew and secrets. It has factions that operate in the open and factions that operate in the comfortable dark beneath everything else. It is a city of constant arrival and constant departure, a place where everyone is passing through, and many of those people have been passing through for decades. The 5th edition revival of Spelljammer, published in 2022, made choices that the original setting's fans received with complicated feelings. The new Spelljammer in a Box product streamlined many of the original setting's more elaborate cosmological details. The phlogiston was removed from the revised cosmology entirely, replaced with the Astral Sea as the medium between crystal spheres, which tightened Spelljammer's connection to the broader 5th edition cosmological framework, but eliminated one of the most distinctive features of the original. The detailed crystal sphere lore was significantly compressed. The Neogi, the Jif, and the Hadozi were present, but the sense of a fully elaborated interstellar civilization with its own deep history and its own ongoing political conflicts, the Skrull and their patient preparation, the Arcane and their inscrutable commercial empire, the Elven imperial fleet and its centuries of wild space dominance. Much of that specific texture did not make the transition at full depth. This is not a condemnation of the 5th edition product. Different editions of the game serve different purposes and different audiences. The new Spelljammer introduced the concept of wild space and astral travel to an entirely new generation of players, and that matters. But it is worth acknowledging what exists in the original material that has not yet been fully revisited: the depth of the Skrull history, the complexity of the Neogi slave culture as a genuine moral challenge rather than simply a monster encounter, the Rock of Bral as a fully functional city with its own internal politics and social geography. These are things still waiting in the original source books for someone to bring them forward. And that is the truth that runs beneath everything you have explored tonight. The forgotten settings of the Dungeons and Dragons multiverse are not forgotten because they were unworthy of being remembered. They are forgotten for the mundane reasons that things become forgotten in the real world. Market pressures and corporate decisions, and the simple scarcity of attention in a world full of competing demands. But the worlds themselves are intact. Cerelia is still out there, its bloodlines still carrying the divine essence of Mount Daysmar, its regents still playing their centuries-long game of political dominion and blood theft and diplomatic maneuvering against a backdrop of shadow world intrusion and on-Sheglian expansion. Zakhara is still there, its corsairs still cutting through warm blue water, its Shahr still sending their tiny Jinn out into the genie courts to beg for borrowed spells, its philosophers still debating the finer points of enlightenment under a copper sun. Mastika is still there, still balanced on the exact moment before contact reshapes it irreversibly. Still beautiful and terrible in the way that honest settings about civilizational collision will always be. Mystara is still rotating slowly on its axis, its known world still conducting the long competition between Thaiades and Alphasha, its hollow world still glowing with the light of its interior sun, the Nithians still building, and the Askans still fighting, and the Millennians still debating in their Senate, as they have done without change for longer than the surface world has any memory of their existence. Spelljammer's original cosmos is still out there, the crystal spheres still spinning in the luminous flow of the phlogiston, the scroll still waiting, the rock of Bral still turning in the dark, the arcanes still selling helms at prices that are fair to everyone except the buyer. These worlds exist. They are real within the logic of this game. And this hobby, and this sprawling, contradictory, endlessly generative creative tradition, they are waiting for the players and the dungeon masters who will crack open the old source books and dust off the old maps and say, yes, this is where we are going. Because the multiverse was always meant to be infinite. It was always meant to contain more than you could see from any single vantage point. The forgotten horizons are not closed to you. They are simply waiting for someone willing to make the journey. Rest well